You recently read Ray Dalio's new chapter that he released, chapter 2 for his new book, and you wrote a pretty deep dive on basically what you think he got wrong, right? So maybe spend a little bit of time kind of talking through that. I know you mentioned it earlier, but just what your takeaways were and kind of what do you think he got wrong?
Well, I think so. I'll hit on a couple pieces. Number one, he talks about understanding money, debt, and credit, and all that sort of stuff. But then he starts with that, but then he gives like such a really weak definition of what money is. He's like, oh, money is a medium of exchange, and it's also sometimes used as a storehold of wealth. I was reading that, I'm like, what? Like you can't exchange something that's not valuable in the first place. So it's like that, it doesn't make sense. And I sort of argued that unless you give a much deeper definition of money, the whole argument that his entire chapter sits on just falls apart. So I kind of like to define money as something deeper. It's a mechanism via which participants in society can effectively collaborate. Like if you don't have that mechanism, society goes out the window. You can't, money is used to represent the products of one's time and labor. In other words, their work. And if you don't get that depth, you don't appreciate how important money is. And then you can, call it something as stupid as, oh, it's just the medium of exchange. So that's sort of where he starts off. Then he starts talking about, yeah, money doesn't have intrinsic value, blah, blah, blah. But then he turns around and starts to talk about how gold became money because it has intrinsic value. And then I was like face palming myself again. I'm like, okay, there's no such thing as intrinsic value. All value is subjective. Simple as that. The example that I like to use is, we all value air, right? Like the ability to breathe. But if you have a child and you're both, let's say, in a car accident and you fall off a bridge and you're in the water and only one of you is going to be able to breathe, what are you going to value more in that moment? I know this is a brutal example, but you're going to value air or you're going to value your child's life. So it's a very, what that means is that at that point in time, the value you place on air is much lower than the value you place on, your child's life, for example. So it's all value is subjective. Now, gold didn't become money because of some notion of intrinsic value. It has specific attributes that we converged upon as human beings to say that, hey, that is a really good object to represent the time and work that I'm trading for money. So that was another area. Then there was a couple of sections that me and him agreed on. He talks about how central banks are able to rig the game. And he's 100% right, because that's one of those things where I can see it was highlighted in my article. Whilst the rest of us idiots spend our too finite resources, time and energy to receive money in return, there's a few organizations who just gets to change the rules for themselves at the expense of the rest of us. And it's madness. Then what else did I hit? Things about where he talks. Okay, so he mentions a section in there. While the virus triggered this particular financial and economic downturn, something else would have eventually triggered it, which I agree with. And regardless of what it did, the dynamic value would have basically been the same, because only intervention would have worked to reverse the downturn. And I kind of really poked at that, which is we didn't actually reverse the downturn. I actually think we've just accelerated the downturn. By intervening again, we didn't actually fix anything. We broke the shit even more than it was broken before. So the correction, or this corona crash, or whatever we're going to label it as, was the system fixing itself. And instead of getting out of the way and allowing the system to fix itself, we just doubled down on breaking the fucking thing. And for me, when I see someone who's supposedly, as intelligent or whatever as Ray is, to assume that these interventions are some form of solution just baffles me, because it's not what we're doing. Like we can't perpetuate that narrative, because all we're doing is running the same game again. Like the narrative has to be the system is fixing itself by correcting, and we are breaking it more by intervening, not the opposite way around. And until we do that, we're never going to fix shit.
Why do you think that he hasn't, at least publicly, kind of crossed the chasm and said, "Hey, this Bitcoin thing is real"? Do you think it's that he doesn't understand it, he doesn't believe in it, or it's more of a sleight of hand and actually he's doing one thing behind closed doors and not talking about it publicly?
Yeah, dude, this one's one I've battled with for a long time. So, I mean, most of the writing that he does, like particularly prior writing, this one, I think there was a lot of, if you asked me that question 6 months ago, I would have probably said it's the latter. I think that, there's a bit of sleight of hand going here, and he's buying up Bitcoin like a boss in the background. But reading this one, I was like, man, he's actually missing a few really fundamental pieces, like, intrinsic value being one of them, and, presuppositions around, he's right about credit cycles, but he's defining everything within that paradigm. And, he talks about these paradigm shifts, but he seems to be unable to acknowledge that Bitcoin is an example of a paradigm shift, or a phase shift, something that is different to what exists. So he's either, there's either something really, really, really not clicking for him with respect to Bitcoin, or he's just, because he's got such a, I guess, a public presence, it may be dangerous to, publicly promote Bitcoin, because, I mean, you got this $200 billion asset now, which, I mean, if he turns around and says, Bridgewater is allocating to Bitcoin, we're probably gonna, we don't need the halving. It'll be called the Dalio inning.
Well,
Like,